Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 26th of October, and today's video is going to be really eventful because we're discussing large-scale Ukrainian withdrawals from Hirnyk, or as the Russians refer to it, Garnyak, and from Selydove over the past 24 hours. Also, the Russian advance south of Shakhtartske. More generally, the Russians capturing Alexandropol and various other fields that are located around the Vavts River, both on the eastern and western banks of the river. So there is so much to get into today. I also do want to discuss some drama in relation to the Ukrainian formations that are actually defending in Hirnyk, in particular the 210th Territorial Defense Battalion. It's really been mired in some controversy along with the 110th Mechanized Brigade. So we're going to talk about that once we reach that part of the front line. But I want to begin by discussing something that I briefly discussed yesterday, but at the time it was not fully confirmed. There were only just these reports from Russian Telegram channels about the events south of Shakhtartske. So they were discussing the first Russian attacks located south of the village along the paved road. But based on the footage released from the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, we now see that there were several Russian axes that branched out and took over territory that, if we're going to click on this yellow polygon, indicates a capture of 14 square kilometers. It is a large-scale advance through a region that really was devoid of any presence from the Ukrainian side. It's definitely an area that the Russians could have and now have asserted themselves in. And you can look at the way the roads are positioned and the way that the Russians advanced towards heights to understand why they're doing it from this direction and how it could threaten an area, not just Shakhtarska, but also Nova Ukrainka and more generally the Ukrainian defenses in this region. As you can see, as we zoom out, you do have this sort of a hodgepodge of Ukrainian trenches, dugouts that have not been fully connected together. There was simply not the efforts, the focus on this specific part of the front line to do so. But you can see that over time there were various nodes that were built up and expanded along the same general horizontal direction. But it was not enough to create a unified body of defenses. So each, I suppose, light yellow color is more isolated in its own right. And as you can zoom in over here, you'll see that the Russians are about, if we're measuring it, a couple of kilometers away from the static defensive positions, about 2 kilometers away. And after that point, you just have a complete lack of density in the Ukrainian defense. You have this large portion of open fields in between Shakhtarske and the paved road, making it all the way up to the outskirts of Andriivka. And in that region, it's just open fields, a few villages nearby, and not that many dugouts, not that many strongholds over there. And that's why the Russians, I feel it's completely understandable that they would go out and begin launching attacks over here in an area where, at the very least, they have a manpower advantage that is 4 times more than the Ukrainian side. And we went through the specific order of battle in one of my earlier videos last week, and I counted it. I estimated the Russian garrison more generally in Velika Novosilka to be 20.5 thousand, I believe, and I think I said the Ukrainians had like 8.5 thousand, and I was trying to be generous to the Ukrainians, especially with this region over here that is located east of Velika Novosilka. This region is really only being held up by the 58th Motorized Brigade, a unit that was completely repurposed after 2023 and has been thrown back into the fighting over the past year in the sector. And they're not the highest caliber units, but given what the Ukrainians have in the sector, it's really something that they'll have to suffice with. In terms of the advance, though, the Russian forces, they pushed from Prechestivka, and then they sort of branched out. According to Ukrainian sources, there was an initial attack in the afternoon, I believe, of the 25th, so yesterday, and that came from Zolotaniva, utilizing 8 vehicles. At least one of them was destroyed during the attack, according to the Ukrainian side, but they claim that the Russian column was able to make it all the way to the southern outskirts of Shakhtarske before being forced to retreat, and in the process actually paving the way with this large corridor, gray zone, for future attacks that actually occurred later that evening when the Russian forces launched an attack with 15 vehicles. And the Ukrainian side say that they cannot account for all the vehicles, that they don't know necessarily the fate of all of them, but that at least that one more was destroyed, and that some of the vehicles that were accompanying that lead vehicle that got destroyed also withdrew along with it back to the Zolotaniva area. At the same time, the Russian sources actually released footage of their attacks that are geolocated to indicate advances. So you can see over here, this is from October 25th of the Russian mechanized assault. I think in this video, I recall seeing 8 vehicles, a lot of them with either camouflage or turtle tank sort of build up on their perimeter. advancing northwards, and you just don't see enough Ukrainian response in this region, simply not getting the same amount of artillery rations or mortar rations in this region. And even the FPV crews that are rather notorious in this region, they're not necessarily involved in the defense here. A lot of those FPV units, like the Granite unit, for instance, and there's a few others like Bulava, they're more active northeastwards around Bohoyavlenka and Konstantinivka, Antonivka. So there aren't as many trained crewmen to do the same sort of defensive activity when the Russians surprise the Ukrainians over here in Shakhtartske. So basically, the perfect storm for a Russian advance, an area that's not well defended, relatively isolated actually from the rest of the Ukrainian local nodes. And so for now, it appears that the southern part of the village is a gray zone, that the Russians have solidified a path through which they can conduct future attacks and actually begin to infiltrate and fully get a foothold over there. And regardless, you also had this Russian attack that I believe had 5 vehicles in total sort of branch out and not go to Shakhtarska directly, but actually go to some of the open areas to the north. And this is sort of hilly region. There are some tree lines over here. I'm going to click on geolocations to see where this marker is located. You can see it over here, 5 Russian vehicles advancing north of Prechestivka. And then one other video is over here. You can see it shows that the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, they had troops dismount and take over a local trench. And this is occurring south of Novoukrayinka, which is another village that is now under extreme pressure because, again, you're seeing the Russian attacks with armored elements from the west, potentially cutting off roads that are supposed to connect Novoukrayinka to the rest of the southern Donetsk garrison. And then you're seeing the parallel attack occurring around Bohoyavlenka. So Novoukrayinka is in a very big predicament right now. More generally, you could see next over here, these are the higher elevated regions. The Russians are advancing from a valley on which you have the highway located, but because the Ukrainians don't have that much density in this ridge region, it does make it easier for the Russians to take up positions over there and then use those heights for their advantage, which I believe in large part is not just to advance directly northwards towards Andriivka, which is definitely something that they will be doing in the future, but it's also to sort of prepare the battlefield from the eastern flank to begin attacks onto Velika Novosilka. But at the same time, we have to look at Bohoyavlenka because you can see here a Russian advance amounting to 6.1 square kilometers, and it could actually be larger because you had Ukrainian sources reports that 2 armored vehicles were able to make it all the way into this western farmhouse region, and they were able to do so unabated. They were not targeted on the way there, even though they were passing around the southern perimeter of a town that is supposed to be under full Ukrainian control with a very strong sort of coalescing garrison that retreated from Vuhledar. And so they were able to set up camp. Those Russian soldiers that dismounted in the warehouses, and the fighting continues, which means that by extension, southern outskirts of Bohoyavlenka are now also contested, and there's fighting going on over there. So it's going to be very important to see as a litmus test if the Ukrainians can push them back. If not, then the Russians will have a very easy route to squeeze the remaining Ukrainians away from these positions and then advance along this chain of ponds and local routes all the way to Uspenivka to the north. Now, looking at the Vovcha River, you can see the final settlement that was under Ukrainian control on the eastern bank has now been captured by the Russians, at least most of it, because I don't know for sure what's going on with these final few houses in the southern portion, but definitely there are no longer Ukrainians there, so it's only a matter of the Russians mopping up and clearing out these remaining few plots of fields and dugouts. Here you can see the geolocation showing that the soldiers from the 110th Motorized Rifle Brigade, a DPR unit that's recently been activated and is really involved with the capture of Zelana Drucha, Zoriane, a bit to the south. They were engaged in this village hopping operation with very minimal Ukrainian resistance because of their really lack of an option but to withdraw across the river. So then the 110th Brigade really picked up the pieces and raised up their flag over here, indicating a control and capture at the very least of 4 square kilometers. Now you have all of the eastern flank of Kurakivka under Russian control and preparations being made for crossings over here. That's something that should definitely worry the garrison in Kurakivka. But at the same time, it's not just a really pressure coming in from the east because, again, now you could have these individual Russian soldiers directly firing into Kurakivka from across the river. You also have pressure coming in from the northeast, from Zoriane, where the Russians already crossed over the river and got most of the village under their control, and it directly flows into Kharkivka. There's not any sort of defensive positions in between, which will make it very easy for DRGs and for just general motorized rifle troops to begin assaulting over here. Same thing with Hirnyk. Hirnyk, the situation here may actually be worse for the Ukrainians than I'm making out to be with my mapping, because mine is relatively conservative. And that's because, again, whenever you have these sort of large scale advances and fluid retreats, it's always very easy to fall into the trap of exaggerating advances in a certain period of time. So it's just easier to err on the side of caution, even if eventually a lot of the things that are reported, I'll mention them, but I'm not going to say them definitively, end up manifesting. Here you can see advance of 0.9 square kilometers by the Russian side, at the very least in northeastern Hirnyk, basically backing up what Russian sources were saying yesterday and 2 days ago about their push to capture more than half of Hirnyk. And this is occurring in an area that is relatively dense in the town. A lot of duplexes, apartment buildings, local hospitals around here, the grocery stores, they're all coming under Russian control. And you can see that actually based on the video from the 114th DPR Brigade. They raised a flag above one of the apartments over here, labeled October 26th, but it could be from a couple of days earlier. And as a result, you do have this large gray zone as the remaining Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from their positions over here after really sustained pressure. They've been engaged in heavy fighting over here for over a month, mainly confined to the outskirts of Hirnyk. But even that was really over an extended period of time difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to. The attrition levels were simply too high. Russian artillery bombardment and drone bombardment actually rapidly increased in recent weeks. And due to all the pressure coming in from the flanks and the really precarious situation with the supply lines into this sort of salient, as I refer to it, the salient in the red rectangle, it really created an unnerving situation for the garrison in Hirnyk, which led to a lot of individual and spontaneous withdrawals. We're going to get to the most famous one in a second. And then the Russians, they don't have to engage in a costly urban battle. So a lot of their forces here that have recently re-engaged in the fighting after a period of rotation, like the 110th and 114th Brigades, they're not actually losing that many men right now as they sift through these houses, because there simply isn't that much urban type of fighting. Of course, through open fields, there's going to be a lot of combat, but within these specific settlements, which had amazing positions for firing and ambushing, targeting Russian advances, it just can't be utilized. There's no means to do so because the Ukrainians have to, of course, look out for their own lives first. So the best example of this is the 210th Territorial Defense Battalion, a part of the 120th TDF Brigade. I don't actually think it's stationed anywhere at the moment, the wider brigade structure. Some information from many months ago says that they're operating around the Chasiv Yar region, but there's nothing recent. And this one battalion, it was attached to the 59th Motorized Brigade, which is the main unit that was involved in gluing together all of this Vavcha River fronts. And for a while, there were 3 battalions that were operating around here. I have them marked on my map all consecutively here. And I don't think they're actually as engaged at this present moment in the fighting, but a couple of weeks ago they were. September 26th, that's when the 210th battalion joined within the umbrella of the 59th Brigade and was assigned to defensive positions in the northern part of Hirnyk and was supposed to resist. And there was a pretty cohesive structure and communication between the various sub-divisions of the 59th Brigade. And then a couple of weeks later, so probably around early to mid-October, that's when the rotation occurred, where the 59th Brigade was moved out and replaced by the 110th Mechanized Brigade. So 110th Brigade, we are really well aware of this unit because in previous encounters, they've been acting as these sort of vanguard units that hold onto the front line to allow other units to withdraw. That's something that happened around Avdiivka, and they were also involved in the entire conundrum related to the Zenith plant that was encircled, and then you had this very hectic retreat by the Ukrainians across a wide open field that occurred last year in Avdiivka. So this unit has been involved in a lot of the high-intensity fighting. It was involved also in a recent arrest and then was re-engaged the front line in the area northeast of Pokrovsk. But now it's being moved to an area that has much more intense fighting, and it's supposed to sort of bridge the gap after the large-scale attrition encountered by the 59th Brigade during its fighting that also occurred east of the river in Krasnohorivka. So that rotation was completely understandable. But then you had the 210th Battalion fall under the umbrella of the 110th Brigade, And there were issues. There were issues because there wasn't a proper streamline of artillery or mortars or heavy equipment being sent to the units, to the men within this battalion. So they were supposed to stay in forward positions that were just being constantly bombarded by Russian artillery and air force, and also by drones, as we discussed. And they were not receiving the proper supplies needed to continue with this sort of drawn out urban fighting. And the straw that really broke the camel's back was in relation to a retreat of the 154th Territorial Defense Battalion, a part of the 117th Brigade, that was supposed to be holding in the sector between Novoselidivka and Izmailivka. So over the past week and a half, they have not been able to maintain control of the hinterlands between these two villages. They were pushed out from positions south of the St. Basil mine, and they're now sort of just roaming around here in an open area, 5 kilometer stretch of land between the line of contact and Ilinka. And there's actually preliminary Russian reports of an advance in this direction to try to cut off and put additional pressure onto the remaining forces in the Kharkivka salient. So that's something to keep an eye out for in the near future. But that withdrawal really put additional pressure onto the battalion that was defending in Hirnyk and made it much more difficult for supplies to come in. In the period of mid-October, the battalion reported on 11 soldiers being killed and 70 being injured. I don't know to what degree, but you can imagine it's a relatively small battalion. I wouldn't expect it to be at full capacity because the information I saw is that it spans from either 250 men to 1,000 men. So I would say it's much closer to the 250 number. So then you're looking at a large chunk of the unit that suffered some varying degrees of casualties. And this is one of those units that does not have the same sort of battlefield experience. It doesn't have the willpower also in such an intense battle to hold out for months like the 59th Brigade did. And I know for sure those battalions were in similar conditions for many, many months. In this case, the Territorial Defense Battalion was in a really precarious situation for a bit less than a month. And they already really had the lack of willpower to remain in the certain region and had the inclination to withdraw on their own. So you did have the spontaneous withdrawal of large portions of the battalion around October 12th from Hirnyk all the way up to the main Ukrainian defense node in Pokrovsk itself. So that was a large-scale withdrawal, and a lot of it was blamed on the command of the 110th Brigade for not caring for the men of this battalion. Then the remnants that stayed over here, they were pressured to go back and really set up defensive positions in Hirnyk itself. They were put under really severe pressure on October 23rd. And then on October 24th, the 110th Battalion Brigade, they went to the positions of the battalion, the sleeping positions, like where they were sleeping, and they arrested a lot of them, forcibly arrested them, put them into buses, shipped them away to areas that still aren't known, but presumably either some sort of punitive measure or to send them back to the front line. And there was also live ammunition fired into the air, presumably to try to pressure them to, acquiesce to these demands. And then certain elements of the battalion, they were able to escape. And now whatever remnants were able to escape that were not apprehended by the 110th Brigade, they're being ordered just unofficially by local commanders. Nothing official has been addressed yet by the Ukrainian higher command in this region, but they're being told to sort of regroup around Barvinkove and Kharkiv Oblast. And you also have the wives of the members of the unit that were apprehended trying to demand that there be some investigation into the matter. So that really should give you an insight into just a microcosm of the very hectic sort of culmination of intense Russian pressure and then the lack of Ukrainian coordination between units in this region. And right now it's just getting to a boiling point more generally for several battalions in this region because they are located in a salient that is going to be under immense pressure due to this Russian bulge that has been established in Novoselidivka and Izmailivka. It's something that really has to be kept an eye has to be kept out for because FPV crews are going to begin making it into the St. Basil mine area and begin to roam around this 5 kilometer strip and target any movement back and forth. Even the retreating forces will be targeted as a result. And so it is a difficult situation in the Hirnyk region, and it could actually be worse in terms of mapping for where the Ukrainians are in control of than I'm showing on my map. Here in Selydove, here you're going to see that it's very similar in the sense that the Ukrainians, although they would have really liked to drag out fighting, and I said that they would try to the best of their ability, I do think that's what they've been trying to do. Definitely over the past month and a half / 2 months, that's what they've been doing in the entrance to Selydove. But once you have a culmination of circumstances, in relation to Russian advantage in artillery, aviation, even drones in certain regions over here, when you have several axes putting pressure at the same time, and then utilizing local geography and strong points to the advantage of the Russians to squeeze the Ukrainians out of certain regions. When you have a lack of proper manpower pool being sent into this part of the front line, with all of the responsibility for defense being put onto one main unit and then some ancillary units that just don't have the same sort of experience within the armed forces of Ukraine, it is inevitable that eventually there will be some sort of break in the lines, especially lines that haven't been built up. You don't see as many prepared defenses over here. The Ukrainians were not prepared for drawn out urban conflict in Selydove, more generally because they were really imagining a year ago that Avdiivka would be able to serve as a meat grinder that would hold out for much longer than it actually did hold out for. And then they thought the same thing for the Vovta River line. So continually, they've been sort of incorrect about the time frames, and now as a sort of intermediary measure, they were forced to hold on to Selydove. And once the circumstances became very, very difficult, the Russians were able to break through, put pressure on the rear in Vishneve, and inadvertently, the Ukrainians, I suppose, they don't have much of a choice actually, but to withdraw from these regions before they are enveloped, before they are fired upon during the withdrawal. And actually, Russian sources are reporting that they've been able to cut off this other route, the final route that is actually under Ukrainian control, that connects Selydove to the broader Donetsk front. That would mean this highway over here between Selydove and Pokrovsk, according to some Russian sources, it has been cut off. And the map, according to a lot of these sources, looks something like this, more like this, where you have this deep Russian bulge and it's very uncontested. You just don't have the Ukrainian strategic depth in order to send in small units to repel this. So they're really helpless about the rear. And then also there are claims being made by Russian sources that they've been able to capture corridor number 11, as it is referred to. Corridor number 11, I have it marked as partially a gray zone, partially Ukrainian control. That could be incorrect, of course, by now. But corridor 11 includes some of the final apartment buildings and large-scale facilities that are under Ukrainian control. Because as you may know and see on the map, a lot of these parts of the city center, which have just massive apartment blocks, have been taken over by the Russians. And you can see that here with this geolocation and polygon. This is from the center of Selydove. The Russian forces here, you could see there is a flag atop of the Selydove Technical School indicating an advance. And then also just massive large-scale advance being verified even by Ukrainian sources occurring both along the road south of Selydove and then also along the rail line that makes its way to Vishneve. So the Russian forces, at the very least, are partially in control of this village. And this is really important because not only does it put the emphasis on the Ukrainians to withdraw and do so in a hectic manner, which means that the Russians could pick off more of them when they withdraw, but then it also provides the Russians with a forward base to continue attacks even deeper and prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a new sort of temporary line of defense for stabilization measures. So that would include branching out along the Solona River towards Hirnyk, Petrivka, and some of the other nearby urban, or not urban, but just clusters of villages in this region. As a result of a lot of these very deep penetrations, the Ukrainians were left exposed in the southwestern parts of the Solona River, around Seltralna Avenue, and in the southern parts of Selydove. This is a video from today showing the 15th National Guard Brigade withdrawing, evacuating its own men in a armored vehicle from Selydove along this road, meaning that they would have to pass through Russian-controlled territory or then take a detour and advance, or retreat, I should say, along open fields. That's probably what most of the local garrison here is doing. That consists probably at the moment of several hundred men that are involved in the withdrawal, as most of the 2,000-man battalion probably, or brigade, is no longer operating within the city itself. As you can see, the areas that do still remain under Ukrainian control to a pretty high degree of confidence on my end would be this western area, which is connected to the road that the Russians may have cut off. This is an area that is less dense, does not have as many apartment blocks, and is definitely not a sustainable area for defense, given the flanks, given the fact that it is just not conducive for defensive activities. And now, if we're looking at what's coming up next as the Russian forces continue to solidify control over here, first, I want to show you guys this one geolocation indicating that the Russian forces are actually above Korochenko mine. They've taken it over probably entirely, although this part I'm still marking as a gray zone. The unit that did this, because I want to just mention the Orbats, is the 71st Special Purpose Battalion. I really looked everywhere to see what like the mother unit is, but I do believe that the battalion itself is operating here based on social media posts. I don't know which brigade in Spetsnaz it is a part of, but they're definitely here, and they're the ones that raised the flag above the Korchenko mine. It's interesting because in the video, you actually see Russian soldiers coming out of what appears to be a dugout. So I don't know if that dugout was just a very small hole within the slag heap, or if it's a part of a broader tunnel system that the Russians were able to penetrate through. Now, to look at what I see will occur in the sort of mid future as a result of really facts that can be avoided, dynamics that can be avoided on the ground in relation to a lot of this elevation, for instance, whereas the Russian forces are in control of higher elevated regions south of Selydove that then extend westwards. The Ukrainians that are resisting in rear villages over here along these two ravines, they're on a way lower elevation. And then you can see in green, here's the higher elevated areas. There really are everything in between all these fields that the Russians are now taking over. It's going to be very difficult on an individual basis to defend those areas, but I do think that the Ukrainians have no other choice but to really have a mounted defense in this region, because after that point, after those clusters of villages, you have this large 7 kilometer almost span of territory before reaching the next feasible line of defense. And by then you would have the southern flank of Pokrovsk completely taken over by the Russians. That's something that cannot be allowed to occur in order to prevent the Russians from repeating similar fates in Selydove as for Pokrovsk itself. That would be a very big worry, and obviously the sizes are completely different, but that's why the Ukrainians have to have a level of commitment to the flanks of Pokrovsk that would prevent anything like this from occurring, as it did with the southern flank of Pokrovsk. Over here, you would have probably the Russians being able to consolidate control along this paved road running through Novodmitrivka, Sonsivka, and then all the way to the Kurokova Reservoir. Everything to the east is simply in a compromised position and would be too easy to bombard and attack during any movement back and forth. And so the hope for a Ukrainian intermediary line would be that it would be just this sort of vertical, solid line that could concentrate Russian forces in a certain region and then try to repel them back as a result, just for an extended period of time, not anything permanent, while the Ukrainians work on solidifying vertical trenches that could be built starting in Pokrovsk, making their way all the way to Andriivka. That would be the goal, in order to prevent the Russians from being able to breeze through, hop through villages, hop through open fields, and then begin to have a lot of pressure knocking on the door of Andriivka, the final major Ukrainian defense node in southern Donetsk. And then the same thing for Kurokove. Kurokove would be under a lot of pressure in either scenario, either if the Russians were able to penetrate deeply or if they were only able to advance a couple of kilometers westwards. In any case, Kurokove is well within range of Russian artillery, and not just from the east, but also now from the north. So that is all important to mention. As we zoom in over here, you can see that there is one other advance that I want to mention. It's west of Novohordivka. It's just based on a geolocated piece of footage from the Ukrainian side. I think the name of the group is Epic 2. They had an FPV strike targeting a Russian vehicle, and this just shows a slight advance through this large swath of open areas in between Lysivka and the Selydove highway. Simply an area that has not been committed to by the Russians because of all their other commitments that we've discussed throughout this video. But 68th Air Brigade, they're really involved in the defense here. They're making sure as an incentive that the Russians don't attempt any sort of large-scale assault operations here. But given everything that's unfolding around Selydove, I wouldn't be surprised if there are then efforts to get control over this corridor of territory marked next. It is on a slightly higher elevation than the nearby regions, both overlooking Ukrainian positions to the west, around sort of the suburbs and sort of rear villages leading up to Pokrovsk, and then also the southern perimeter defense line with all the trenches that is located on a relatively low elevation. That area is also exposed. If it would be exposed if the Russians were to take over the local hill where the 68th Brigade is currently defending. And so that's all that for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.